lost my job as a cave guide. It was supposed to be just another ordinary, boring summer job. I needed a way to save money for the upcoming school year, so my geology professor offered to put me in touch with a local caving group. From June to August, the group hosted camps for children ages 12 to 14. Over the course of each 4-day, 3-night session, campers would hike along limestone rivers, learn about underground ecology, receive guided tours of 3 different caves, and even spend the night in one. Along the way, of course, they would be treated to the usual cringy team-building activities, cold bug-infested showers, and barely edible food familiar to summer camp attendees everywhere. My task, on paper, was a simple one. I was to guide the campers through the caves in groups of about 20, and keep an eye on them while they stayed overnight. We worked in pairs, with one guide at the front of the group and another at the rear, to make sure that no one got lost. We carried helmets, 3 sources of light, walkie-talkies, first aid kits, and extra rope. Even though the caves that we worked with were well mapped and well trafficked, no one expected anything to go wrong. Well, almost no one. Scoutmaster Dan got his nickname from his khaki short shorts with too many pockets, his knowledge of knots, and his obsession with being prepared. In over 40 years as organizer, Dan Raffeld had never lost a camper, and, as he was fond of telling us, he planned to keep it that way. We were expected to find our way through each cave at least 5 times before we even began escorting campers through them, and every guide lived in constant fear that the Scoutmaster would suddenly turn up to inspect their gear equipment or quiz them on first aid procedures. As a college boy from the city with no experience, I had expected Dan to be especially hard on me, but he held us all to the same stern standard, no more, no less. The excitement in the air during those first green, cool weeks of summer was infectious. By the time we had mowed the green lawn of the main campground, cleaned the facilities, and learned the layout of each cave, I was surprised by how eager I was for the campers to arrive. Unfortunately, I had forgotten what preteens could be like: the body odor, the bullying, the constant boundary pushing. It was tough enough just to get them quiet and moving in the same direction, let alone to make them understand the importance of safety underground. There were times when I almost wanted one of them to wander off, just so that they would finally learn their lesson. But then I thought about what it would be like to be alone in the dark so far underground, feeling the cold, damp air on your skin and knowing that it was just a matter of time until your light ran out. As a new guide, I spent the first 3 weeks at the back of the group, keeping a head count and radioing the leader, Miriam, about any issues. Miriam was a lanky, sunburned redhead who'd been working as a guide for 5 summers now. She had a sheepdog attitude toward the campers. As long as they were all present for each count, she couldn't have cared less about their eye-rolling complaints and snide comments about her height or her freckles. What really mattered to Miriam, the reason she kept coming back, were the caves themselves. The fast-flowing underground streams. The beautiful, alien rock formations that could be found nowhere else. The unique wildlife that had never seen the sun. For her, our work was more like a stroll through a beloved park, with the minor inconvenience of herding a group of accident-prone campers. Thanks to her enthusiasm, I also began to enjoy my time spent in the caves, except for one of them. It was just my luck that it was that cave where I was told to lead my first tour. In theory, 𝓢𝓞𝓒 Cave was the easiest option for a first-time guide. The other 2 caves, Pine Knot and Church Falls, each had their own drawbacks. Pine Knot Cave was like a maze, with so many levels and passages that sometimes even experienced guides lost their way. Church Falls Cave was small, but there were a few tight squeezes where 1 or 2 campers inevitably discovered their own claustrophobia and needed to be helped through. 𝓢𝓞𝓒 Cave, however, featured large and well-explored passages, with few pits or other dangers, at least on the main route. Even so, the place gave me a bad feeling. Maybe it was the sheer size of its high-ceiling galleries. No matter where you directed the beam of your headlamp, there was still a lot of darkness left over. There was also the fact that 𝓢𝓞𝓒 was one of the most well-known caves in the area, which meant you might find yourself suddenly face to face with other cavers or drunk local teenagers. Miriam and I had never had any problems, but still, there was something unsettling about running into strangers in that lightless subterranean world. I think what bothered me most about Silverlode Cave was the graffiti. There's usually graffiti in the more popular caves, but the images in Silverlode just felt wrong. Worm-like black squiggles. Faces not quite animal, not quite human, spray-painted on the stone in lurid colors of lime green and purple. My heart raced whenever I rounded a corner and caught one of them in the beam of my headlamp, sneering at me like it knew some awful secret that I didn't. Then of course, there was the history of the place. According to Scoutmaster Dan, Native Americans had mined precious metals in Silverlode Cave for centuries until they suddenly and inexplicably stopped over a millennia ago. Later, during the Civil War, Silverlode Cave had been a hideout for Confederate guerrilla fighters. Imagining some illiterate farm boy getting his legs sawed off by lantern light while listening to the echo of his own screams was enough to make the cave feel hostile, if not downright menacing. Miriam didn't seem to mind, or even notice, but she wasn't leading the campers that day, I was. To make matters worse, it was the group's final cave tour, which meant that we'd be spending the night in the cave. I had done overnights before, but only in Pine Knot or Church Falls, never in Silverlode. So far, the worst things to happen were a twisted ankle and a camper who woke up screaming because a cave cricket crawled into his sleeping bag. Between the cool air, the coziness, and the complete darkness, I had actually found caves to be pleasant places to sleep, so far. As many times as I had been through Silverlode Cave with Miriam, however, I had never spent the night there, and I wasn't looking forward to the prospect. I knew right away that the three boys in the back of my group that day would be trouble. Alex hid Kyle's headlamps in his bulky pockets. Kyle dumped Sean's water on his head during the safety meeting, and Sean tried to push Alex into the creek on the hike to Silverlode Cave. The trio talked over us constantly, their preteen voices cracking in the humid summer air. When we reached the mouth of the cave, Miriam and I gave them an ultimatum: either behave or go home. It worked for about an hour. With a kind of low cunning, they knew that once we were deep into the cave, we wouldn't risk splitting the group unless it was an emergency. Unfortunately, they were right. From my place at the head of the 20 campers, I could hear them laughing and throwing rocks into the darkness. Even Miriam, who almost never lost her cool, wound up shouting. Her words reverberated eerily through the tunnels so that I could hear her anger, but not what she'd said. In fact, there were times when I wondered whether the voice I was hearing was even Miriam at all. The constant tension grated on my nerves and kept me from paying attention to things that I'm sure I would have noticed otherwise. Things like the shadowy figure that seemed to be following our group. The first time I saw it, I thought it was just another caver, backlit by one of their companions' headlamps. When it appeared again, however, I wasn't so sure. Maybe it was just a shadow that happened to look sort of human, but if it was, then what was casting it? And why did it seem to be moving closer each time? I warned myself to cut it out. There was clearly no one else in the cave with us. We would have heard them, and besides, it was impossible to navigate through the jagged rocks with no illumination. I considered radioing Miriam about it, but I didn't want to risk the campers overhearing and getting scared, or making myself look like an idiot. As it turned out, I didn't have to. We were about 15 minutes from the first break spot when my walkie-talkie started to go off. At first it was just a rushing sound, like wind or the creek that flowed through the cavern, but then it changed. Gibbering, scratching, a voice whispering my name. Since Miriam's talk button was pressed down, there was no way I could respond to ask her what was going on. I called a halt to the group. Moments later, there was a loud crack, and the noises stopped. We had paused on a low plateau where dripping stalactites hung from the ceiling. It wasn't so low that we had to crawl, but standing up wasn't exactly comfortable either. I was grateful for my knee pads. The 20 campers packed into a circle, swigging Kool-Aid from plastic bottles and wondering what was going on. Miriam scrambled over to me, her face a mask of pale anger. "I think one of those kids pinched my walkie-talkie. Whoever it was, they must have freaked out when you called a halt and dropped it." I heard something rattle when she shook the plastic device. "Well, either way, I found it, and it's completely dead." I groaned. It had barely been an hour and already something had gone wrong. Miriam must have seen the look on my face, because she gave my shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "You're doing fine. Let's just keep the group close enough to see each other, okay?" She bit her lip. There was something she wasn't telling me. "Hey, have you noticed that?" "Ow. Lego, you asshole." Alex, or maybe Sean or Kyle, suddenly started shouting. There was a small rock slide. "I'll handle this," Miriam hissed, and disappeared. And for a while, it seemed like she did. Since Miriam and I couldn't contact each other by radio, she turned on the infrared setting on her spare headlamp and hung it around her neck, where it bobbed in the gloom like a glowing red eye. That way, I could be sure that I wasn't getting too far ahead. Except, as we moved through the cave, I could have sworn I saw other dim red lights moving in the darkness, some further back, others closer up. I told myself that it was probably just Miriam's secondary headlamp reflected in dripping water or mineral veins in the walls, but I knew that didn't make any sense. There were too many of them, and they were moving with a will of their own. I tried to distract myself by throwing myself wholeheartedly into my explanation of Silverlode Cave's history and geology, but every time I looked up, the danger in the dark felt closer. 2 hours later we'd reached the large chamber that would serve as our campsite. It was a wide, flat area, formed naturally by a curve in the subterranean stream. It was only about 8 p.m., but I knew from experience that getting 20 campers fed and bedded down would take at least 2 more hours. I kept an eye out for the shadowy figure or the phantom red lights, but there was no sign of anything strange while we all unpacked. When the campers had finished eating and were getting ready for lights out, Miriam approached me. "I wanted to ask you earlier, have you noticed another caver around?" My blood ran cold. Miriam went on without waiting for a response. "It's just strange that someone would be in here this late, someone other than a few loud local teenagers, I mean. And whoever they are, why wouldn't they be using any light?" To be honest, I hesitated. I've got a bad feeling about this. "Should we, I dunno, call it off?" I silently prayed that she'd say yes. Everything about this trip was wrong like those eerie graffiti faces spray-painted on the walls, wrong like the rusted Civil War-era bone saw we'd passed near the entrance, wrong like the abandoned veins of precious metals that lead downward into the dark. Miriam shook her head. "Do you want to explain to Scoutmaster Dan and 20-odd parents why they have to come pick up their kids at 1 a.m. on a weeknight? Because that's what will happen, assuming we get them all out of here on no sleep and with just one working radio." She had a point. Whoever, or whatever, was out there, it hadn't made any hostile signs toward us so far. Just ignoring it and hoping it would go away wasn't the best option. It reeked of helplessness and desperation, but I couldn't think of anything else to do. The campers' muffled laughter and whispered conversation suddenly sounded sinister. As I performed the final bed check, I kept expecting to find one camper's sleeping bag ripped to shreds or squirming as some monstrous, unnameable thing with too many legs came bursting out. Despite my fears, all 20 campers were present and accounted for. After a long day of caving, even Alex, Kyle, and Sean were already fast asleep. Unlike them, I couldn't bring myself to crawl into my sleeping bag or close my eyes. I was too afraid that I'd wake up and find myself being dragged off into the dark. There was no dawn underground, but Miriam and I had our alarms synchronized for 6 a.m. That would give the campers a total of 6 hours to pack up, eat, trek out of the cave, and get cleaned up before their parents arrived to pick them up. The early wake-up was met with groans and complaints, but we were used to that. The important thing was to get them moving. After a breakfast of granola bars and sports drinks, we rounded everyone up for the morning head count. 18, 19, 20, 21. It was impossible. I thought for sure I had miscounted, but Miriam's count returned the same result. As I scanned the group for an unfamiliar face, I told Miriam to dig the roster out of her rucksack. She returned moments later, angry, confused, and scared. The roster's gone. So are my spare headlamps and the extra food. It's like a bear went through my pack. I checked my own pack and found that it, too, had been ransacked sometime during the night. I shivered. Whatever had done it would have been just inches from my head, and I hadn't even noticed it. Time was of the essence. We couldn't count on our spare lights any longer. Miriam nodded to the assembled group of 21 campers and whispered, "Are there any faces you don't recognize? Anyone who stands out?" It could have been the pale kid standing at the edge of the group with a blank expression on his face, his shirt buttoned up wrong and his boots unlaced. It could have black-haired boy with glasses who'd somehow gotten his arms and legs covered in gray-green cave mud. It could have been the skinny one with a blonde bowl cut who was chomping on his 6th granola bar like a wolf gnawing on a bone. It could have been any of them. In the past weeks, all of those preteen faces had started to blend together. I'd been so distracted by everything that had gone wrong that I was no longer sure exactly who I had come into the cave with. The campers, too, didn't seem to notice that anything was amiss, and some instinct screamed at me to keep it that way. We needed to get out of 𝓢𝓞𝓒 Cave, and fast. Ironically, Alex, Kyle, and Sean were the only ones I felt sure of, so I put them right behind me in line. I knew they wouldn't like that one bit, but I figured they would do or say something stupid to alert me if some horrible imposter came crawling across the ceiling to slit my throat. The campers were always quiet on their first morning in the cave. Usually, it was just the uncanny feeling of waking up in absolute darkness that did it, but there was something more at work this time. Even the densest of them had seen the fear and confusion on my face. They knew that something was off, and they seemed to realize for the first that they were dependent on us to get them out of here. The goofing off that we'd had to deal with on the trek into 𝓢𝓞𝓒 Cave had been replaced by nervous jitters and whispering. I took a deep breath, forced myself to turn my back on the campers, and began to lead us out of 𝓢𝓞𝓒 Cave. One of the first things that Scoutmaster Dan taught us about caving was the importance of pausing occasionally to note the landmarks behind you. Unlike the terrain above ground, a cave can seem completely different when observed from the opposite direction. Even longtime guides like Miriam sometimes experienced the gut-plunging feeling of looking around at the twisting passages and realizing that nothing at all looked familiar. It hadn't happened to me, not until we began our journey back that day. As we left the main chamber behind, we reached the first sink, a bend in the creek where the water disappeared, only to reappear further along in the cave. The path should have been to the right, but it wasn't. There was only the creek, disappearing between yet another jagged stone wall. The way to the exit had disappeared. I wanted to believe that I'd just made a mistake, that what I was seeing was just the result of my own slowly building panic, but Miriam had noticed it too. She kept mumbling under her breath, rummaging in her rucksack for the plastic-coated map that had disappeared along with the rest of her gear. As an experienced guide, she was taking the impossible change a lot harder than I was. She knew it was wrong, and I had a nasty feeling that if she stayed in the chamber much longer, she'd shut down completely. Most caves have more than one way in or out, and 𝓢𝓞𝓒 was no exception. We normally led the campers via the easiest route, the one that followed the stream, but that was apparently no longer an option. The lower passages tended to flood, and even when the water subsided it left snarls of dead leaves, wood, and trash, muck that fed some of the largest insects and spiders that I'd ever seen. I didn't like my odds of getting the campers through that mess, so I opted for the alternative route through the upper galleries. I tried to swallow, but my throat was dry with cave dust. "All right, campers," I grimaced, "we're going to take a little detour." It was tougher than I remembered. The tunnel grew so narrow that the stone walls scraped against my shoulders, the rough ceiling so low that I occasionally felt the long, alien legs of a cave cricket as it skittered through my hair. These upper passages had a nasty slope. While crawling along them, you were constantly sliding down and to the right, toward a jagged black crevasse that, to the best of my knowledge, had never been explored. It wasn't wide enough to fall into, not even for the skinniest of campers, but it was unsettling. I couldn't shake the fear that it might suddenly begin to expand like a grinning toothless mouth and swallow us whole, or that some unspeakable horror might come slithering out of its lightless depths. I looked back at the campers, their faces flushed with effort, sweaty hair plastered to their foreheads beneath their cheap plastic helmets, and reminded myself that the unspeakable horror was already here among us. But as to what it was or what it wanted, I had no idea. Just an hour left, I reminded myself. In an hour we'd come crawling out into the sunlight, where surely, everything would make more sense. It would turn out to be a misunderstanding, a joke, a trick of the mind born from dark places underground. I was so lost in thought that it took me a moment that we'd reached a dead end. Miriam and the rest of the campers piled in around me, confused by the stone bottleneck I'd just led us into. This couldn't be happening. I had been here before. There was a way out. I would have bet my life on it. And maybe I had. One of the most nauseating feelings in caving is the flickering just before a headlamp goes out. I still had some spare batteries in my pocket, but the sudden blackness in front of me was a grim reminder that our time was limited. The campers were getting restless behind me. Some of them were cursing and warning us that their parents would sue, others were whimpering, practically begging me to tell them that things were going to be okay. I wished that I could. But if this didn't work, we wouldn't have the light or the strength to find another way out. Suddenly, Miriam sprang forward and began digging at the rock with her bare hands. As loose stones fell away around her fingers, I realized what must have happened. A rock slide had blocked the narrow passage ahead. A largish boulder had plugged the tunnel, making it seem to have vanished completely. It took me, Miriam, and 3 of the strongest campers to finally pry the boulder loose. Even after the passage was cleared, the whole thing left me sick to my stomach. It was like something, maybe even the cave itself, had blocked the tunnel on purpose. I would have sworn that the final tunnel was a tighter squeeze than I remembered. 𝓢𝓞𝓒 Cave seemed reluctant to let us go. Dragging myself through with one arm, my helmet off to ensure that my head could fit, I had the awful feeling the cave was a living thing with a will of its own, and that it had decided to crush us to death, slowly. Something brushed against my face, a root. Up ahead, pale moths fluttered in the beam of my headlamp. I had been too tense to notice it, but the cave had been getting warmer. Then I saw it, sunlight, we were almost free, but all I felt was worry. Why were we being allowed to leave? One by one, we clambered out into the woods. Even the campers were too tired to complain, and in the sun that filtered through the leaves I could see the tear streaks on their cheeks. Just like Miriam and I, they were filthy, exhausted, and grateful to be alive. I nodded to Miriam as she heaved herself out behind the last camper. It was time to start counting heads again. 18, 19, 20. Miriam's eyes went wide. She shrugged and shook her head, sure that she hadn't missed anyone. Either the mystery camper had disappeared, or one of the others had been replaced. It would have been so easy. All it would have taken is for the headlamps of the nearby campers to look away for a moment. Then there would have been the clatter of falling stones, a sudden movement in the dark. When they looked again, nothing would appear to be different. But what would have happened to the camper who'd been taken? Were they simply murdered and buried beneath the rocks? Devoured by whatever monstrous thing had replaced them? Or had they slipped through the wall somehow and found themselves alone in another layer of the cave, lost, hungry, and scared, with their headlamp batteries running out? We were 4 hours late to the drop-off point. The parents and Scoutmaster Dan were fuming, but I barely registered their anger. I was too busy searching the crowd, waiting to see whether there was one camper who wouldn't be picked up, or one parent searching obsessively for a child whose face they didn't see. But every one of our campers went home that day. After the disaster of my first cave tour, I wasn't invited back for the next summer's session, but I still wonder about what I experienced in Silverlode Cave. Scoutmaster Dan had told us that he'd never lost a camper, but how could he be so sure? Were there some parents out there who had noticed a subtle and inexplicable change in their child after they returned from caving camp? The kind of change that they only dared to talk to their partner about late at night, after a few drinks, when their child was, hopefully, asleep. He never was quite the same after he spent the night in that cave, was he?